Okay, in chapter 6, Micah 6, 1-8, God, he brings accusations against his people. And then in chapter 6, verses 9-16, he brings more charges against his people, and he pronounces a sentence. And we just started looking at that section when we ended last week, so I'm not going to read it again. I may repeat a little bit of what I said, and then we'll carry on from there. But God, it helps if I turn this on. There you go. But God, he raises a cry of alarm to the city, presumably Jerusalem. And then Micah observes that it is wise to fear God's name. And God calls the city and the nation that the city represents to heed the rod of judgment that he's appointed, probably, as I said, referring to the Assyrians and or the later Babylonians. So he's raised them up as rods of his wrath, and God calls them to learn the intended lesson from the predicted judgment on their disobedience. So he wants them to see that. And he indicates by a rhetorical question that he's not going to turn a blind eye to the sinfully accumulated riches of the wicked, or the smaller than standard measure that the sellers used to cheat people, which was a prohibited practice expressly in the Old Testament. And he sits here and he says here, the scant measure that is accursed. Well, it was cursed by the victims of it, and it was condemned by God. And neither will he acquit one who's cheating people with inaccurate scales and rigged weights. So this is how business was done. And so if I'm controlling the scales and the weights and we're swapping stuff, and I'm just cheating you that way. And it's a horrible thing, and God condemns it. And he says he's not going to overlook that. And in verse 12, he indicts the rich then for using violence and deception to take from those who are unable to prevent it. So we have people who are in a position to get away with cheating people. They have the power, and they're using violence and they're using deception to take from people who aren't in a position to protect themselves. And they're just having at it. And then God tells them he's going to punish them severely. He's going to strike them with a grievous blow because of their sin. See, because of their refusal to honor him in their lives. They're going to live by cheating and depressing and being violent and all of this stuff. And just dishonoring God, treating God like he's a joke. And so he's going to punish them severely for that. And though they're greedy for wealth, that's what's motivating this. And I've told you many times that money makes people crazy. They'll just mistreat people, cheat, lie. People kill you for a pair of sneakers. And it's because of this lust for things and money. And so though these people, they're greedy for wealth, they will experience want. It's just a reversal, right? This is all they care about, and what God is going to bring them in judgment is they're going to experience want when an enemy sweeps through their land. And he takes all their goods and deprives them of their crops. You can imagine, right? You're in a society and then just here comes people from outside and there's nothing you're going to do about it, and they're going to take absolutely everything you have. Everything that you have. And he says that's what's in store for them. And they're going to reap what they sowed in following in the steps of Omri and Ahab. Now, these are two notorious 9th century BC kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. These are notorious individuals who abused their power. They resorted to violence and they practiced and promoted idolatry. That is not the company in which any believer wants to be. You don't want to be grouped with Omri and Ahab. You don't want to be grouped with them because they're bad. So that's what he's saying. They're going to reap what they've sown and walking in the paths of these people. And the end of verse 16, it pictures the coming judgment. He's going to make a ruin or a desolation, make them that, and an object of hissing which is interesting. So they're going to become an object of hissing, meaning a hissing sound from somebody who's either horrified or disgusted, right? Where you wind up, you saying like, or either one. Horrified at what has happened, disgusted by what you've been doing, but they're going to be an object of hissing because they're going to be so judged by God. And all those caught up in the judgment, which is precipitated in large part by the wickedness of the elites. See, by the wickedness of the leaders, all those who are caught up in that judgment, they're going to have scorn for those leaders. They're going to have scorn for those leaders who tolerated and even fostered the society's descent into rebellion. They're not going to be happy when the fruit of that rebellion comes home. They're going to scorn those leaders. They had a duty. Those leaders had a duty. And they had the ability to guide the nation in righteousness. That was their charge. That was what they were supposed to be doing. But they governed as faithless men. As faithless men, fooling themselves into thinking that they could do so with impunity, that they could ignore God, they could lead the society in a wicked direction, that they could kill, take, do whatever they want to, be deceptive, all of that. They could do it with impunity. And when that comes home, when those chickens come home to roost, the people who are wrapped up in that judgment are not going to be happy toward the leaders. Right? You think of any nation. When the nation collapses and falls, the people who supported the leaders all of a sudden hate the leaders. And that's what he's saying here when he sits here, that you're going to bear the scorn of my people. That's what's going to happen to them. Then in chapter 7, 1-6, woe is me, for I've become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires. The godly has perished from the land, and there's no one upright among men. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net. Their hands are on what is evil to do it well. The prince and the judge ask for a bribe, and the great man utters the evil desire of his soul. Thus they weave it together. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of your watchmen, of your punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a neighbor. Have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the man's enemies are the men of his own house. So as Micah surveys the moral landscape, as he looks over Judah, he laments. That's this woe is me. As he looks out over Judah, he laments, woe is me, because he cannot find what he wants to find. And what he wants to find are righteous people. See, he's like somebody who's looking for clusters of grapes or ripe figs after the harvesters have already passed through and taken them all. You see, he's looking to find righteous people, but he finds one. He's like the person who's too late coming, and all those things have already been removed. All he sees, he says, Leslie Allen puts it, he says, all he sees is a self-centered ruthlessness and people riding roughshod over the lives of fellow Judeans. People were going to any lengths to get the better of their neighbors. Dog eat dog, baby. The idea that I owe you anything, that we're a community, out. If I can get you, I'm getting you. If I can abuse you and take from you, I'm doing it. He says, members of the covenant community of Israel were treating one another like warring enemies and wild animals. That's the state of the society. That's the state that the society had dropped to, descended to. And they're skillful at evil. You see here when he says here, their hands are on to do it well. They're skillful at evil and they collaborate in it. Right? The people with political power, the people with political juice, what they want bribes. They want people to pay them to use their political juice in their favor. And the people with social power, they have evil designs to cheat and to exploit others for personal gain. So you see, it's a marriage made in hell, right? I've got political power that they want bribes. I've got these people here who want to exploit and take for personal gain. Sweet. Right? So they simply come together. They come together and weave the evil result of injustice and oppression. You see, thus they weave it together. So these two groups, the socially powerful and the people who have political power, they get together to basically hose all the people in the society who don't have that power. The elites are going to crush those they can crush. And this is what's going on. They're so bad that he says the best of them. The best of them, they're like a briar or a thorn hedge, meaning they're barriers that inflict pain. That's the best you get from them. And then the second part of verse 4, it then moves to the day of reckoning. To the day of reckoning, the day that the prophets, the watchmen, that day that the prophets, the watchmen of the nation had warned about, that day has now come in Micah's vision. You see, it moves to that day of judgment, as Bruce Waltke says, because the nation paid no heed to these faithful sentinels, the prophets, the voice of God. They blew it off. You say, well, how could that ever happen? How could any society ever blow off the voice of God? Just look around, baby. Just look around. He says, because the nation paid no heed to these faithful sentinels, and he gives you some text there, the day God visits them in judgment is now at hand. And that's what Micah is then seeing. He sees this coming judgment. And as God's instrument besieges the city, whether it be the Assyrians or whether it be the later Babylonian invasion, and you have to picture this, in our society, in our world, you have to think of in terms of an ancient society where you're in a city and your city is surrounded by tens of thousands of enemy warriors. And you're trying to keep them out by having them blocked out with walls. And you know that when they come in, they're just spreading death. They're spreading death and taking everything. And so here you see here this idea, this kind of thing that's so difficult. When his instrument, panic sets in. Right? Because you sit here and you go weeks, months, where nothing can come in or out. And people start starving to death. As I say, when you read Lamentations, they're eating children. People start starving to death. Panic sets in. And with that panic, what happens is there's this impulse for survival. It breeds distrust and division, even within the closest of relationships. My survival is at stake. Do you have something to eat that you're keeping from me? You see, it breeds this idea. Are you going over to the enemy? Are you trying to sell us out? Are you trying to save your own skin? And so the intensity, this pressure cooker of this judgment winds up breeding these kinds of things. And Waltke points out, he says, the advent of Jesus Christ into this fallen world, because that text, right? That you remember that from the reference in the New Testament. But Waltke says the advent of Jesus Christ into this fallen world brought the same divisions, Matthew 10, Luke 12, but turned a world where men hate and are hated right side up. But you see the same kinds of divisions. Here the divisions are the fruit of the pressure cooker, where people wind up thinking there's this impulse for survival that leads to division and distrust. And that's what he's talking about. And so Micah sees this judgment and this vision, he sees this judgment coming. And and as I say, these things are serious. You read about it, you say, like that's just armies coming and all this stuff. When you put yourself in there, and you know how frightening that would be, there's nothing you can do except to hope. You hope. And as I said, in Jerusalem, when God smokes those Assyrian soldiers, okay, God saved them. But there are many times when that wasn't the case. Here in Micah 7:7-10, but as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord because I've sinned against him until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light. I shall look upon his vindication. Then my enemy will see, and shame will cover her who said to me, where is the Lord your God? My eyes will look upon her. Now she will be trampled down like the mire of the streets. So here you see the godly with their trust and hope in God through the darkness. Through the darkness. He's speaking as a representative of the remnant. Speaking as a representative of God's faithful people. Micah declares that he will look to the Lord in hope through the darkness of the foreseen judgment. So he sees the judgment clearly. But he will look, as the remnant, he will look to the Lord in hope through the darkness of that judgment. Micah and Longman, they say, as a watchman observes every shadow and listens to every sound. You see, he's got to be on alert. He's just watching. So the godly look for evidence of God's working. You see, in the darkness, in the difficulty, that I just sit here, and it's not that I've lost hope. I am looking for, because I hope, I'm looking for all the indications, any sign of God's movement. You see, and he says to close one's eyes to the working of God, no matter how small the evidence may be, is to open the door to despair. And that's what happens in darkness, where a person ceases to believe that God is with him or her in the darkness, ceases to look for the indications of God's working there. That's when despair sets in, because one feels like I've been isolated. I'm cut off. But the hopeful look and are looking for signs of God's working. And he says that he will wait for the God of his salvation. You see, acknowledging that God acts in his own time. I will wait. He will wait for the God of my salvation. Because you and I have our own schedule. We want to do things then and now. As I say, we oftentimes don't understand, and we want to ask God, why do you do it this way? Why are you doing it on a delayed schedule? Why are you doing that? But he says, I will wait for the God of my salvation. And in doing that, see, he's acknowledging that God acts in his own time, but he's also submitting to that reality. That's the truth. God acts in his own time, and I'm going to submit to that. He will not give up hope in God's faithfulness despite the current circumstances. Despite, you see, current circumstances and his limited perspective, however those things may get together to tempt him to do that, to tempt him to give up hope in God. He won't do it. He will continue trusting in God in the darkness. And, you have in life, you have a lot of things, right? I mean, life can have a lot of periods of darkness. And this is something that I think is very important. That you and I know that God has his time. And if we can hold to that truth and that reality as we suffer and endure through darkness and feel His gaze, know He's with us, but He's working things in a frame that we wouldn't do it if we were God. We continue to hope in Him, and I think that's important because we will be tempted. You see, we'll be tempted from the difficulties of our current circumstances, from our limited perspective. We will be tempted to give up hope. And that's right where the enemy wants you, because when you give up hope, it's a short way to bagging you. You see, when you believe that God has abandoned me, He's cut off, I have nothing, well, then it's a short way for Him to capture you. Now, God remains attentive and active through Judah's punishment. He continues to hear the prayers of His people, though His working may not be obvious. Isn't that true? Right? I mean, God is with them. He's told them they're not going to be ended. He's going to continue working with them through the upcoming hardships of judgment, through the exile and all of that. So He remains with them. He continues to hear their prayers. But you and I know that there are times when it's difficult to hold to that truth. Right? How many times have you said, I've prayed this so many times. Why are you allowing me to suffer? And that's when you think of situations like Job and on, that God has His purposes and He has His reasons for doing things. And the fact you and I can't always see what those reasons are is a real big struggle for us. But when you understand God is God and you're not, okay, so you know that may help. But that's what Micah is urging. And the faith of the faithful, you see, the faith of the faithful is that God, without question, will have the last word. You see, that's the faith of the faithful, that God, without question, will have the last word. So however low the faithful of God may be at any particular moment in history. I think about the early church when they were being tortured and killed during persecutions, when the scriptures were being rounded up and burned, when the entire world and society seemed bent on exterminating the church. I think of the dark times there. And yet you and I know that God had not abandoned them. You see, God had not abandoned them at all. So here however dark situations may be for the faithful of God at any moment in history, whether it's from their sin or otherwise, however difficult their state or situation, the way we would put it is, Sunday is coming. Right? That's the idea. I mean, does things ever look darker than a crucifixion? The one we had hoped, the Messiah, He's dead, the powers of the world and society. Sunday's coming. Amen. You see, and so that's the attitude, you see, that even when I can't grasp and can't wrap my mind around what is going on, He's saying that the faithful people of God, they maintain this hope, and they understand, you see, that God is going to have the last word. He's going to have the last word. They ultimately will be. Ultimately. You may die. Many faithful people have died. Many faithful people have died for their faith. They've been tortured and killed for their faith. And that may happen. You may die, but ultimately, the last day, ultimately, you will be vindicated and you will be glorified. Last man standing, okay? Ultimately, when all is said and done, all of the hurricanes of this world, you're going to be vindicated and glorified because of your trust in God Almighty. All the enemies, all the scoffers, all the mockers, all the persecutors, all the haters, they will experience the great divine reversal. Those who raged against you with all their political power, those who said you were terrible and you needed to be killed or pushed off the stage or discriminated against or whatever it is, All of those voices, you see, God's people will be blessed. Those people are going to see that reversal. God's people will be blessed eternally, and all others, those who are not God's people, will be condemned. Now, that's it. That's the reality. And I know our society says, you can't say that. You can't say that God's going to... Oh, I can. I can. And that's the reality. That's what Micah is talking about. It's all over the Bible. See, and that's the trust. That's our hope. You see, what we understand is God is going to have the last word. Amen. He's going to have it. And he says in 7:11-13, a day for the building of your walls. In that day the boundary shall be far extended. In that day they will come to you from Assyria, the cities of Egypt, and from Egypt to the river, from sea to sea, from mountain to mountain. But the earth will be desolate because of its inhabitants, for the fruit of their deeds. So here we have Micah sees a time when God's people, you see, as members of his glorious kingdom, depicted here by secure walls and expansive boundaries. He sees this time that his people are going to be secure there. This time of a glorious kingdom. And Gentiles from all over the world, symbolized by Assyria and Egypt, and these pictures from sea to sea and all that coming, they will come to this kingdom. As Micah and Longman say, that the Gentiles are to become partakers of the promise through faith is a cardinal doctrine of both Old Testament and New Testament. You see that. And he also sees that the earth is going to be laid waste by God's judgment. A judgment is coming. God's judgment on the sinfulness of its inhabitants. Right? A day is coming. A time is coming when all of this flux, all of this that has happened from the fall forward, all of this agony, all of this suffering, things are going to come to a conclusion. And there is going to be a judgment. And that judgment here is depicted with the earth being laid waste. As Waltke says, he says, this verse finds its consummation at the second coming of Jesus Christ. The judgment that is brought then. And divine judgment will cleanse the earth as part of the making of the new heaven and the new earth. You see, it will pass through this kind of purifying fire. Well, what's happening? Micah and Longman again, they say the prophet can be optimistic, for he knows that his lot is not with the impermanent society in which he lives, but with the kingdom of God. You see, and that's you and I are like that. We live in this world, but we understand God is having the last word, and our future, as sure as I'm sitting here, I can't tell you enough. As sure as we are here, talking, hugging, this kind of thing, our future is the glorious reality of the kingdom of God eternally. Not happy talk. Okay, not just, nudge, nudge, in this, the reality. It's the reality. And so that informs how we live. Right? That's the ultimate. So you and I live here in this world, just going along, but we have our vision set somewhere else. We understand that this place is going somewhere that God has determined, and his faithful people will be brought there, and we will live in that joyful, eternal state. He says in 14 and 15, shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, who dwell alone in a forest in the midst of a garden land. Let them graze in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old, as in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt. I will show them marvelous things. Okay, Micah speaks on behalf of the remnant, God's faithful people, and he urges God to change their current difficulty. They're being isolated from good grazing land in the picture. You see, he urged them to change their current difficulty. They're being isolated from that good grazing land by shepherding them into rich pasture lands, into the lands of Bashan and Gilead, where it's just nothing but plenty. All that we desire. You see, right there. It's a plea for him to again lead them. Lead them into blessings as in the days of old. As in the days of old when he brought them into good life in Canaan. Right here they were, suffering, hardship, pulls them out, rebellion, time. What does he lead them into? He leads them into the promised land. And so he's all playing off of that, and this is the idea, lead us into that time. And in verse 15, it expresses God's response. He promises to show them marvelous things, right? I will show them marvelous things. I will show them mind-blowing things. I will show them things that I cannot even articulate to them. You see, it's too great, it's too grand, but they're going to experience them. And that's who we are. You see, we are. But he says here he will show them these he promises them that as he did when he led them out of Egypt. See, he in his power, because of who he is, because of his power, he will deliver them/us into blessings that we cannot even imagine. Right? We cannot even, you can understand some things. I can try to say things, the pictures that I'm given of the glory of the eternal state. But he's saying that glory is going to exceed your wildest imagination. It's going to be a place where you will never, I say this a lot. People say, well, I'm going to get bored in heaven. You're not. You're not. It's going to be an eternity of complete satisfaction, complete fulfillment, complete love, complete joy. And nothing like it. There's no hope like it. He says in 7:16-17, the nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent, like the crawling things of the earth. They shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall be in fear of you. So here on the day of God's judgment, all of his enemies, who also are enemies of God's people, but on the day of God's judgment, all of his enemies, they will be thoroughly humbled before him. All of the people here who talk so big and mock God and all of that kind of thing, they will be thoroughly humbled before him. I have said many times, standing before God is not like the cartoon where the dude adjusts his tie and says, prepare to meet thy God. I tell you what, anybody thinks that's out of their mind. It's going to be an absolutely awesome thing to stand before God, and they are going to be completely humbled before him. The nations will be ashamed of how they trusted in their own might, which they now will see was nothing. We thought we were it, we were doing, it was us, and when they stand before God, they're going to see that was a joke. That was a complete joke. They'll be so stunned by the glory of God that they'll cover their mouths as they gasp. That's how it's going to be. All of the wind taken out of their puffed up sails. They're going to be like that, and they'll be deafened presumably by the thunder of God's voice and or by the heavenly praise that God elicits. And their abject humiliation, it's portrayed by their crawling in the dirt. They're crawling in the dirt and trembling in fear as they emerge from what they thought were their strongholds. This is our protection. This is what we're going to... There's no protection. There's no hiding. You're coming out, baby. You're coming out trembling. You're coming out completely humbled. And they turn in dread to the Holy One as he prepares to judge them. They fear him. All of the bravado is gone. because they are face to face with the Creator of all things. As the writer of Hebrews says in 10:31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It is not something to be joked about, made light of, thought that it's no big deal. It is awesome to stand before God there. And then he says in 7:18-20, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. So here Micah's prophecy, it ends with praise for the incomparable God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The blessing that is in store for God's people, the remnant who will receive the inheritance that he's prepared for them. That blessing is not because they earned it. The blessing in store for his people, the faithful of them, this great blessing, is not because they earned it. The inheritance, it is not a matter of achievement. What God has planned, the inheritance that he has prepared, that's not a matter of achievement. Far from it. It derives from the nature of God. It derives from the fact that he delights in steadfast love. He delights in showing kindness and mercy. He is the very opposite of the caricature our society has painted. Okay, he's the very opposite of that. A mean God who's quick to anger and eager to condemn. A God who forgives only grudgingly. You got to really pull it out of him. You got to sit here and beat him to get it. That's a lie right out of hell, but it's been sold to all of our culture. That's how they perceive God. And it is slanderous. It is blasphemous to say that about our God. When God passed before Moses in Exodus 34:6-7, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, I put in there, i.e. unforgiven, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. God is a God who majors in mercy. He majors in forgiveness. This is a fundamental element of his being. That is why you and I will receive the inheritance. It's not because we've earned something. It is because of who he is as the gracious, loving, merciful, forgiving God. And this truth's repeated all over. Numbers 14:18, Nehemiah 9:17, several of the Psalms, and Jonah 4:2. John says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 and verse 16, God is love, right? That's our hope. That's our peace. It is not because you say, well, listen, what are you resting in? I'm resting in the fact that I scored so high on the moral scale that I'm going to be able to kick in heaven's door and say, you're fortunate to have me. Okay, well, that's nonsense. Right? That's not what it's going to be about at all. That's why he gave his only son, right? That we might have eternal life, because he is love and mercy and forgiveness. He delights in it. He absolutely delights in it. And God will have compassion on his people, those who respond to his amazing love. He will cleanse them in his mercy, right? We don't treat God like a chump. We don't sit here and trivialize God's desires and will. But as we fail and we're genuine and faithful to God, mercy, baby. Mercy. See, that's the peace. It's not peace for a phony. And it shouldn't be peace for a phony. But for the truly penitent, for the people who love God, just breathe easy, baby. It's the grace and mercy of God. You see, so that's it. And you look at this. So he says he will cleanse them. He'll tread their iniquities underfoot and cast them, the sins, into the depths of the sea, right? That means they're gone. You know, no submarines then. None of that. So when he's depths of the sea, that means those sins are gone. And that's, you see, so he will forever be true to the commitment he made to the patriarchs. And here he's referring specifically to Jacob and to Abraham. So God had promised Abraham, right, in Genesis chapter 13, 14 and 16, also in Genesis chapter 17, he had promised him in Genesis 17, 48:4, you can see it, that he would give all the promised land to him and to his offspring, and that he would give him innumerable offspring. And that promise was reiterated to Jacob. So he gave it to Abraham. He reiterated it to Jacob. You see in Genesis 28, 13 and 14. You can also see in Genesis 48, 3 and 4. Now, so we have this promise. The land, he's going to give the promised land, and he's going to give innumerable descendants to the great patriarchs. That's the root promise, the Abrahamic promise. And regarding the land, D.A. Carson, a well-known New Testament scholar, he notes that as God's revelation unfolds, Carson says, entrance into the promised land, you see, it's indicative of something. The promised land is a picture of something larger. He says, entrance into the promised land ultimately became a pointer toward entrance into the new heaven and the new earth. Earth is the same word as land, the consummation of the messianic kingdom. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, Jesus promises disciples, those who are described as the meek, that they will inherit the earth. And their future is eternal resurrection life. Let me read you this last quote from Donald Hagner. I heard that bell. He says, the earth originally referred to the land of Israel, what was promised to the Jews, beginning with the Abrahamic covenant. But the present context of messianic fulfillment, it connotes the regenerated earth promised in the eschatological passages in the prophets, for example, Isaiah 65 and 66. And of course, the innumerable offspring, they are here through the new Israel, right? Where we have Israel, the true Israel of faith, and then we have the grafting in of the Gentiles. So we have this new Israel that is here, the Israel of God, that I think the best reading of Galatians 6:6 indicates. You can look at Philippians 3:3 too, about we're the circumcised. So Romans, of course, 11 is where the Gentiles are grafted in. So these innumerable descendants, you see it here, it is ultimately, the ultimate vision is the consummation of the kingdom of God with all of God's faithful people living in an absolute, perfect existence where there's no death, mourning, crying, or pain. Nothing but love and fellowship. There's nothing like it, brothers and sisters. Thanks.